We were just singing about calling out to God again and again, and that He's our hope and He lifts us up in times of trouble. What do you do if you call out to God again and again and He just doesn't answer you? What if He doesn't lift you up? What if it feels like He has completely and utterly abandoned you? Today we're starting a series on the book of Habakkuk called How to Live in Dark Days. And drawing on a number of different people for this series, one of them being Tim Keller. And so between now and the end of June, I'm going to be speaking 5 different times, and we're going to spend 5 Sundays on this little book. You say, Habakkuk, what's that? Well, that's a little book toward the end of the Old Testament. We have to say, don't know much about Habakkuk. We know he was a prophet. We're not even sure exactly how to pronounce his name. So I just say Habakkuk. Now, to put this series into perspective for you, I'm going to tell you where I'm coming from. As many of you know, my son died by suicide about 7 years ago. And so once a year or so, every couple of years at least, I like to rehearse out loud the most important lessons that I learned during those very, very dark days. The book of Habakkuk is about dark days for Habakkuk and the people of Judah. Evil days. How do you make it through dark days? And so today is, God, why aren't you doing anything to help? Why aren't you answering? Why aren't you doing something? Now, evil days can refer to stuff that we go through personally. A friend dies. We lose our job. We get fired. Our spouse decides they don't want to live with us anymore. Dark days, personal dark days. But dark days can also refer to a whole time that a country will go through. Right now, there's countries living in dark days. Well, what's an example of a country living in a dark day right now? Syria, right? Ecuador with the earthquake recently. In Habakkuk's time, the country of Judah was living in dark days. Moral corruption and threats from the outside. But dark days, evil days, can also refer to a time when the whole world goes through trouble. 100 years ago, there was World War I, and then the flu epidemic, and then the Great Depression that went around the world, then World War II, and so you had decades where the whole world was going through dark, evil days. And that's what it was like in Habakkuk's time. Babylon was rising as a power and was sweeping across the world and was wiping out entire people groups. People groups disappeared after the Babylonians. You never hear about them again. Dark days. How do we live in dark days? We want to start this morning by reading Habakkuk chapter 1. I'm going to ask Kathy to come and read for us. The white letters are Scripture. The yellow letters are there to help us understand, because first of all, it's Habakkuk asking God some intense questions. God answers, and then Habakkuk asks some more questions. So the yellow writing is to help us know who's speaking. The white letters are Scripture.
Habakkuk chapter, I guess I need this. I can yell, but this will make it easier. Okay, there we go. Habakkuk chapter 1, 1 to 17. The prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. Habakkuk's complaint. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in righteousness, so that justice is perverted. And the Lord answered, Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like eagles swooping to devour. They come in intent on violence. Their hordes advance like desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock the kings, they scoff at rulers, they laugh at fortified cities, and then they build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty people whose own strength is their God. Habakkuk's second complaint. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net. He burns incense to his dragnet, for by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his nets, destroying nations without mercy?
Now, from reading this passage, you can see that Habakkuk is living in dark days, in evil days. And in verse 3, he asks a question, why do you make me look at injustice? This word that's used, that we translate as injustice, is a broad word which means evil, sorrow, and grief. And what Habakkuk is saying is, why have you made it so that everywhere I turn, I look at evil? And he's referring to the moral condition of his country. The last number of verses talk about these fish and these dragnets and stuff, and my guess is he had Ecclesiastes 9 verse 12 in mind when he wrote that. It says, as fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds are taken in a snare, so men are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. Just before Habakkuk, King Josiah was king, and he led Israel in this great revival, and things were looking good, and his leadership gave hope to the people of Israel that they were going to be in for good times. But when he died, his sons became kings, and their leadership was corrupt, and it led to moral corruption and injustice that spread throughout Judah. And so Habakkuk cries in verse 4, the law is paralyzed. People are not obeying God's law. And there are military threats coming on Israel from the outside. Babylon is rising in power. Egypt is going to try to stop them. And of those two armies you're going to meet, one or both of them are going to march through Israel. It's not a good thing to have the army march through. Evil days. And so Habakkuk and his people are facing evil times. Not only that, but God doesn't seem to care. God doesn't seem to do anything. He doesn't respond. So Habakkuk is crying out, why don't you answer my prayers? Why aren't you doing something? Why are you letting this happen? Why all this evil? Why all this injustice? And he cries out. Now, he isn't the kind of guy who's going to just let things slip. So he basically confronts God. He becomes rather bold and brutally honest with God. In verse 3, he says, why do you tolerate wrong? Why do you tolerate injustice? Very bold on Habakkuk's part. But in verse 12, he goes even further. And some people will say he crosses a line in verse 12. It doesn't come through so much in English, but in Hebrew, it's clear. In verse 12, he says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? Are you not infinite? Are you not eternal? God, are you not infinite? Again, in English, that doesn't sound so bad, does it? But in Hebrew, this is very confrontational. It's a particular Hebrew construction or grammatical phrase. This is not a request for help, but it's described as a punishing statement. In English, he would be saying something like this. I thought you were infinite. I thought you were all wise. I thought you were all powerful, but clearly you are not. Very confrontational. Nowhere else in the Bible is anyone this confrontational to God. He comes very close to saying that. The word translated, are you not, is only used 96 times in the Old Testament, and most of those 96 times involve vigorous human arguments. There is nothing like this in the rest of the Bible. Habakkuk is not approaching God with courtesy and respect. He is in anguish. Do you know why? Well, in verses 2, 3, and 4, he is saying, why are you allowing all this injustice, all this evil? Look at Israel. You say you're going to bring salvation out of Israel. And yet Israel is becoming immoral and corrupt. Why are you allowing all this? Why don't you do something? And God answers in verses 5 to 11. And his answer basically is, well, I'm raising up the Babylonians. I'm raising up the most ruthless, bloodthirsty people there's ever been in the history of the world. And they are sweeping across the world, and they're coming to your country, and they're going to destroy it. They're going to conquer your country and kill a lot of people. And Habakkuk says, you call that an answer? I just complained. Why are you allowing all this violence and immorality and corruption? And your answer is, I'm going to send more evil and more violence and more corruption. I'm going to allow these people to destroy your people. You call that an answer? And God says, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And it's basically Habakkuk saying to God, are you nuts? I thought you were supposed to be infinite. I thought you were supposed to be all wise. I thought you were supposed to be good. He is wrestling with God and challenging God, but note this, he sticks closely to God. On the one hand, he is challenging God. He's asking difficult questions. He's struggling with doubts. But on the other hand, he never entertains the idea that he can leave God, that he can stop praying, that he can stop obeying, that he can stop following God. It's not even an option for him. Note this. Habakkuk is bold towards God. He is challenging God, but he does it while he's praying. He's calling God my Holy One. In verse 12, after he says the most challenging, the most insulting thing anybody says to God in the Bible, he then says, my Holy One. He's praying. He's wrestling faithfully with God. Now, I find that there are very, very, very few people who can do what Habakkuk is doing. You see, on the one hand, we have people, maybe often traditional religious people, who say, oh, don't question God. Habakkuk, you've crossed the line here. Whoa! Don't ask those questions. I think often in the church we need to give this appearance that all is good. Or we think we do. And we don't ask difficult questions. Maybe we're afraid if we ask too difficult questions, our faith is going to fall apart. And maybe God can't answer our questions. Or maybe our relationship with Him can't survive. Right after our son died, I asked all kinds of very difficult questions. You know what I found? I didn't find really anybody who would talk to me about it. Christians were very quick to change the topic and give me pat answers and say, Russ, let's not think about this stuff. So on the one hand, we have people who feel they can't question God. On the other hand, and this is the majority of people in our society, there's this enormous confidence in our own human reason and our perception. And so we say, I don't see how God could possibly bring good out of any of this. I don't see how a good God could allow suffering and evil in this world. And so I'm just not going to believe in Him. I don't need this. I don't need a God like that. I can't believe in a God like that, so I don't want anything to do with Him. Now, Habakkuk does neither of these two. On the one hand, he's so honest, much more honest than we often are. He challenges God. He asks difficult questions, but on the other hand, he would never dare think of leaving God and stopping to believe in God. In fact, when he says, my Holy One, I think what he's saying is, God, if I didn't believe you were, I wouldn't be so upset if I didn't believe you were holy. But I know you are. I wouldn't be so upset if I knew I could leave, but I know I can't. Because if I can't figure out life with you, how in the world am I going to figure out life without you? Where else would I go? That's why I'm so upset. So you see, Habakkuk wrestles with God in honesty. And God writes this down in the Bible. You ever wonder, why does God put this kind of stuff in the Bible? We talked about this. This is probably a couple years ago. I talked about Psalm 88. Psalm 88 ends with the verse, something along the lines of, darkness is my best friend. The psalmist is in so much anguish, he's saying, God, darkness is a better friend to me than you are. That's how the psalm ends. Why does God put that stuff in the Bible? Well, Derek Kidner, I quoted him that when I was talking on Psalm 88. He says, the reason God puts this in the Bible is He knows how we respond as humans when we are desperate. He knows what we're like when we're desperate. The reason Habakkuk is free to ask these kind of questions is because he knows about God's grace. He knows that he can ask these kind of questions without God rejecting him. He also knows that his faith isn't going to blow up and disappear just because he doesn't get an answer to his questions or doesn't get an answer that he likes. He can ask. He can safely ask because he understands God's grace. And so Habakkuk asks these difficult questions of God, and God responds. His answer basically is in verses 5 and 6. And his answer has two parts. The first part says, I'm going to tell you something that you're not going to believe. You're not going to understand. That's verse 5. Verse 6, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians. They are ruthless people. They're going to sweep across the whole earth. Habakkuk says, why all this injustice and violence? Where is your salvation? And God says, I'm going to bring salvation by bringing more violence and more injustice. That's how I'm going to work my salvation in this world. And you're not going to understand it. I want you to note what God is saying here. He is saying to Habakkuk, don't dare judge me on your timetable. You see, Habakkuk is saying, I don't understand. You said you're going to bring salvation out of Israel. Yet Israel is turning corrupt, awful nation. Why? Come on, God, do something. And God says, I am doing something. What I'm doing is I'm raising up the Babylonians, this terrible people. And they're going to come and conquer the Jews and take them off into captivity, into exile. And Habakkuk says, that's your answer? And God says, yes, that's my answer. Now we can see something that Habakkuk couldn't see. And that is this, that the Babylonians didn't come and conquer Israel. The Jews would not have been spread across what became known as the Roman Empire. But because of the exile, Jews were spread out across the whole world. When the Jews were given opportunity to return back to Israel, some did, but most did not. And so across the Roman Empire, you had synagogues filled with Jews, and then pagans who started to believe in God, God-fearing Gentiles. 600 years later, that's why Habakkuk couldn't see. It took 600 years. But 600 years when Christianity began to spread, who do you think was the most receptive people to the gospel? Well, it wasn't the Jews, it wasn't the pagans, but it was these God-fearers in synagogues across the nation. And Christianity spread like wildfire through them. If it hadn't been for the exile, Christianity would never have spread like it did. There's no way Habakkuk could have seen that God was bringing salvation out of injustice and violence and evil. A modern-day example of this is China. When Chinese turned communist, they kicked all the missionaries from Europe and North America out of China. And what did we do as a church? We said, oh no, what's going to happen? God can't work without us from the West. 100 years of missionary work down the drain. But now we know, without the missionaries, the Chinese Christians took control of their own church. And it became, even under the communist rule, became the most vibrant and fastest growing church in the world. And the Chinese church is likely to change the world. There are people who estimate that in 75 years from now, because it's such a fast-growing church, 75 years from now, there will be 300 million Christians in China. It's going to change the world. When the missionaries were first kicked out of China, there's no way we could have seen that. We didn't see it. We said, oh no! How can anything good come of all this evil? When bad things happen to us, we say, I don't get it. I want to know now. God, what's the answer? I want to know now. But we can't. If you look closely at the conversation between God and Habakkuk, it's kind of comical. In verse 5, God says, I want you to know what I'm going to do. So I'll tell you, but you're not going to understand it. When I tell you, you're not going to get it. So the conversation kind of goes like this. Habakkuk says, tell me what you're going to do. God says, okay, I'll tell you, but you're not going to understand. But Habakkuk says, tell me. God says, okay, here it is. And Habakkuk says, I don't get it. And God says, I told you you wouldn't get it. It's like dealing with our second granddaughter. She's 4 years old. Her default setting is to scream when she doesn't understand. And so the more you try to explain, the more she screams. And you try to calm her down, and she screams. The kid's got good lungs. She's done a lot of screaming in her life. Now, why is it many people today say, I don't see how God could possibly bring anything good out of this. I don't see how God allows suffering or evil. There's so much trouble in this world. I can't believe in Him. I can't believe in a God who allows this. You see, there's a far greater distance between our minds and God's than between my mind and my 4-year-old granddaughter. Far greater distance between our minds and God. So how in the world do we think that we can understand God and understand what He's up to, understand everything about Him? To say that God has to make sense doesn't make sense. To say that I have to understand God doesn't make sense. In fact, we're often worse than our 4-year-old because eventually, it takes time, but eventually the 4-year-old stops screaming and trusts her grandpa when he's all tired out. Okay, so let's kind of review what we've been talking about. First of all, Habakkuk is caught in these evil times. Everywhere he looks, he sees moral corruption and immorality and evil. And so he cries out to God and says, why aren't you doing something about this? And God says, well, I am. I'm doing something. I'm raising up the Babylonians. I'm doing something that's going to wipe out Israel. I'm bringing salvation out of injustice. I'm bringing salvation out of judgment. I'm bringing salvation and justice out of violence and oppression and injustice. I know that you're not going to understand this, Habakkuk, but that's what I'm doing. Now, what does all this mean for us today? Well, 600 years later, the Apostle Paul is preaching, and he brings in this Habakkuk stuff. This is Acts chapter 13, verse 41. That's where we'll get to 41 eventually. But Paul is preaching the gospel, and he's talking to people about Jesus and how God has raised Jesus from the dead. And then he says, therefore, my friends, I want you to know that through Jesus, the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. Through him, everyone who believes is set free from every sin, a justification you are not able to obtain under the law of Moses. Take care that what the prophet said does not happen to you. And now he quotes Habakkuk. Look, you scoffers, wonder and perish, for I am going to do something in your day that you would never believe, even if someone told you. Paul looks at Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 5, where God says, I'm going to do something that you're not going to understand. I'm going to do something that if someone told you, you wouldn't believe it. Paul looks at that and says, this verse is talking about Jesus, where God says, I'm going to bring salvation out of judgment. I'm going to bring justice out of injustice. I'm going to bring light out of darkness. Paul says in Habakkuk, he's talking about Jesus. And we say, well, no, wait a minute, he's talking about the Babylonians. But what Paul is saying is there's a principle here. The principle that I'm bringing light out of darkness, that I'm bringing justice out of injustice, that I'm bringing peace out of violence. That principle finds its ultimate expression in Jesus Christ. You know why? Because on the cross, Jesus experienced the injustice, the violence, the hostility, experienced the evil. And out of that, God brought justice for us. He brought peace. He brought light out of that dark, dark time. Jesus experienced corruption, a corrupt trial. He experienced injustice. He was tortured. He suffered. He died. You see, Habakkuk said, I don't understand what you're doing. I don't understand why you're allowing this injustice. How can you bring salvation out of injustice and violence and evil? And God says on the cross, that question is finally answered. It's finally explained. Because on the cross, because God is holy, he can't just walk away from our sin and say it's all okay. Somebody had to pay for it. Jesus experienced judgment on the cross. He paid the penalty. He took the judgment. So he's the ultimate example on the cross of bringing salvation out of judgment, of bringing light out of darkness, of bringing justice out of injustice, of bringing redemption out of suffering and evil and difficulty. Now, people standing at the foot of the cross that day, I'm sure would have been thinking, I don't see how God could bring anything good out of this. The Messiah, killed on the cross. How is that good? But we can see that that is the ultimate good. Now, some of us here might be experiencing evil times. And in the midst of our evil times, we might be saying, God's not answering. God's abandoned me. I pray and nothing happens. I'm about ready to walk away from this God. I want nothing to do with him. Because I don't understand what he's allowing to happen in my life. I don't understand how I got to this. I don't understand the unfairness of it. I don't understand why God doesn't help me. How can a good God allow anything like this to me? Why should I stay faithful to him? That's what this passage in Habakkuk is about. The ultimate principle, or the principle that is ultimately shown in Jesus Christ, that God brings justice out of injustice, that he brings salvation out of violence, evil, corruption. You see, on the cross, Jesus was the ultimate Habakkuk. Because Habakkuk is perplexed, he's confused, he's angry, he's upset, he's wrestling with God. He's saying, God, where are you? And yet, in the midst of all of that, he stayed faithful to God. He kept praying, he kept obeying. The ultimate Habakkuk in the Garden of Gethsemane is praying out to God, God, is there any way around this? Is there any way out? Can you somehow take this cup from me? And yet he turns and says, but not my will, but your will be done. Unconditional, faithful wrestling with God. On the cross, Jesus was abandoned. He cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? When we go through evil times today, we might feel abandoned. Habakkuk felt abandoned. We might feel abandoned, but we're not. Habakkuk couldn't see, but God was working in the background. We can't see, but God is working in the background. We might never understand. Like in my case, God could have prevented my son's suicide, right? not a trick question. God could have prevented it. After my son died, lots of people came with stories of how God prevented their death or their son. God could have prevented it, but he didn't. One of my big questions was why? Not going to get an answer before I croak. But that doesn't mean that God has abandoned me. You see, Jesus really was abandoned on the cross, so that when we go through evil times, we only feel abandoned, but we're not. And so when you look at Jesus on the cross, abandoned, suffering injustice, struggling, God, take this cup if you possibly can, take this cup from, but he remained faithful. When you remember that, then the question for us is, can't we remain faithful in the midst of our dark days? Because we know that God loves us. He showed us that by Jesus dying on the cross. We're not abandoned. God is at work behind the scenes, but we can't possibly understand how this all works. And so sometimes we need to let go of trying to figure it all out and say, God, I know that principle, that you bring justice out of injustice. You bring salvation out of evil, violence, suffering. And because Jesus remained faithful, we can remain faithful. Makes sense? I hope so, because I can't do any better job explaining it. Let's pray. Father, I pray for those here today who are in the midst of evil times. Times of confusion and struggle and pain. Some of us look at the world around us and we say, if God allows so much injustice, maybe I don't want anything to do with that, God. Father, I thank you that Jesus remained faithful in the midst of the injustice that he suffered. That Habakkuk wrestled so intently with you. And yet he stayed in relationship. He kept praying. He kept following you. And I pray for those of us in evil days right now, where our world is caving in around us. We feel like giving up hope. We feel like walking away from you. I pray that you would give us power in our innermost being to understand how great your love is for us. And that we don't need to be afraid, even if we're asking questions that are scary. We don't need to be afraid that you're going to abandon us. And we don't need to be afraid that our faith, that you are somehow unable to handle all of this. Father, I pray for comfort for those of us in evil days. Give us strength. I pray this in the name of Christ. Amen.